So our speaker today is Dr. Silvia Lindtner. She is an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan and has a joint appointment with the School of, or I'm not sure, a joint appointment with the School of Art and Design. She did her PhD at the School of Informatics at UC Irvine, and basically everyone that you love dearly at UC Irvine was on her committee. You were very fortunate to work with a lot of very good people. So Silvia is going to talk today, as you see behind me, about making culture in DIY and hacking in China, which is incredibly interesting both in talking about hacking and making and that world, but also particularly looking at this in China. One thing that's pretty interesting about Silvia and her research is that she helped to form a collective in China where practitioners and industry and researchers and scholars are coming together to talk about and create and work on these sort of issues. So really unusual, but probably a really good source of material for your work. Wow, this is a packed room. So if you are sitting in the corner with any of the chairs and more people start coming in, be a good neighbor and try to pull them down a chair. This also is being filmed, so you know if people want to watch this again later, you can always watch it. So with that, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Silvia.
Thank you so much for this humbling introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, especially to Kirsten Foote, who invited me, and the Department of Communication. It's a real honor to share some of my work with you. I will be talking about DIY making, hacking related things, but I'm also going to be presenting some, theoretical working through that I've been doing over the last couple of months for a book project. So I would love your feedback, anything, that I'm missing or that's unclear. I really want this to be sort of also interactive, and I would very much value feedback. So I just wanted to say this up front. So I'll explain where some of this work is coming from. I'm drawing from long-term ethnographic research in China. But before I go into that and into explaining a little bit about my method and what I've been doing over the last 6 or so years in China, I wanted to jump right into this and actually start with this image. This is, as all of you undoubtedly recognize, an Apple iPhone. And even today, the Apple iPhone is in many ways one of the quintessential examples of technology innovation of the 20th century. This here is a photo of the place where the iPhone was made. This is Shenzhen, a 22 million metropolis, just a subway ride north of Hong Kong. And in comparison to the Apple iPhone, the city itself has a much less reputable name. So usually, to most people, Shenzhen is known, if it's known at all, as through stories of invisible labor or through stories of Foxconn, which is the factory that produces for Apple. It's actually a Taiwanese company. But more recently, yet another story about Shenzhen took rise. It's a story about Shenzhen being the new Silicon Valley for hardware, or a Hollywood for makers. Shenzhen is here celebrated as a rising innovation hub, and what you see here on the screen is actually a photo of the Maker Faire Shenzhen. Maker Faire is a gathering that brings together people who are passionate about DIY making and tinkering to show off their creations. And this was the second featured Maker Faire in Shenzhen, in China, in 2015. And the buildings you see behind sort of these banners of the Maker Faire didn't actually exist half a year before the Maker Faire took place. So the district itself, is celebrated now as a rising innovation hub, and the Maker Faire, the hosting of the Maker Faire itself, enabled in part sort of this image making of Shenzhen now as a new site of innovation. Can I just get a showing of hands? Who has been at a Maker Faire before? Okay, a couple of people. And who has been in Shenzhen before? Okay, also a couple of people. So I'll talk a little bit more about what making is, what the Maker Faire is throughout the talk, and also what Shenzhen is and how it's currently remaking itself. So hopefully a lot of this, for those who haven't been to a Maker Faire, who haven't been to Shenzhen, this should become also more clear throughout the talk. So but what led to the sort of story of Shenzhen now being this new place for innovation? So there were stories suddenly about devices like this. So many of you probably are familiar with the Pebble smartwatch. It was a programmable smartwatch. Its co-founders raised the single largest Kickstarter campaign in history, more than $10 million US. And this device was actually made in a partnership between a startup working out of a hackerspace and factories and designers in Shenzhen. Or similarly, this device, Oculus Rift, which was bought by Facebook in 2014 for $2 billion US. Similar story, a hackerspace, hackerspace members partnering with factories in Shenzhen to actually build this virtual reality goggle. And other stories, that sort of contributed to this rise of Shenzhen as a new place of innovation is the story about hardware incubators. This is a logo of the first hardware incubator that set up shop in Shenzhen in 2012. So as typical for an incubator, it invests in startups and helps them grow and helps them learn how to pitch their work. And this one was the first incubator focused on hardware production and started in Shenzhen in 2012. But then there's also stories about makers, who started commenting about Shenzhen, about their journeys and experiences of Shenzhen. So this is a quote here from Dale Doherty in an interview with me back in 2014. This was Dale Doherty's first time in Shenzhen. Dale Doherty, some of you might know, is the founder of Make Media, founder of the Maker Faire. So in many ways, that key quintessential venue that has helped proliferate ideas about making. And so Dale comes to Shenzhen for the first time in 2014 to participate in the Maker Faire, and he tells me, well, if you're in Detroit and you just want to get something made, that's really difficult because the manufacturers, they're used to talking to auto companies, and then even if those auto companies aren't talking to them because they don't have any work, they still don't want to mess with you. And then he compares this to Shenzhen and says Shenzhen is different versus, people come up to him, makers come up to him and say, I live in the manufacturing capital of America, but I can't get things made. Whereas in Shenzhen, this represents a place where they're still making a lot of things. That expertise is concentrated and detailed there, and not only sourcing parts, but people who know what they're doing. And a similar story to Dale Doherty's story here is reflected in a TED Talk by Choi Ito, head of the MIT Media Lab. So here on stage, he actually shows a video of a tour that the MIT Media Lab is hosting every year now, taking students to Shenzhen. And here on the stage, during his TED Talk, Choi Ito actually reflects on his experiences of his first time in Shenzhen. And he's somewhat astonished, records his experiences as what was happening in Shenzhen. They were not just making PowerPoints or prototypes, they were fiddling with the manufacturing equipment and innovating right there on the factory floor. The kids in Shenzhen make new cell phones like kids in Palo Alto make websites. So there's a rainforest of innovation going on. What you thought you could only do with software, they are doing with hardware. So in all of these stories, Choi Ito's commentary about Shenzhen, Dale Doherty, the hardware incubator, the celebration of Shenzhen as a rising Silicon Valley for hardware, in all of these stories, the imagery of the city is deployed in a very, very different way than the sort of more typical image we have of the city. So here the city is portrayed as carrying potential for China's future, a site of technological and scientific expertise and progress that can be realized by bringing together the opportunities presented by the global maker movement and China's manufacturing expertise. So both of these stories, though, I argue and want to demonstrate in this talk today, are creating an all too stark and simplistic binary. So both fail to engage with Shenzhen in ways other than very familiar tropes and narratives. So the trope of cheap labor and low quality production on the one hand, and the trope of modernization and innovation on the other hand. So each story avoids acknowledging also the other, and both portray the city only in its relationship to the West. So in the first one on the left, right, Shenzhen and with it China is portrayed as a site of numb execution of ideas created in the West, while the second suggests that Shenzhen is now finally catching up and becoming and following the footsteps of Silicon Valley. So in this talk today, I want to give you a glimpse into what is left out in both of these stories, both of these somewhat universalizing stories, and I'll examine who and what makes Shenzhen today. And so I propose that understanding the making of Shenzhen as this rising innovation hub is best understood as unfolding through what anthropologist Anna Tsing has called the sticky materiality of practical encounters. So if we follow Anna Tsing, universals like capitalism, or we could argue innovation and globality, only exist in their particulars. They're enacted and negotiated in practical encounters rather than constituted an abstract force. So I apply Anna Tsing's approach to explore who and what makes Shenzhen as rising innovation hub in these very specific encounters. So my goal in this talk then is to show you the following two things. So first, the particulars of making Shenzhen. I want to show you how they are produced through the making of careers, of livelihoods, of things, of products, but also of spaces and of entrepreneurs. And second, I want to show you that the making of Shenzhen has become enrolled in a much larger project of remaking the nation, or what I call of hacking China. And I use the term hacking here really metaphorically, so not to refer to the more common connotation of illegally hacking into a system, but as it is used in contemporary maker culture, so a kind of opening up of existing structures and systems to remake them from within. And I'll come back to this term later. So as I said earlier, I'm drawing from long-term ethnographic research, and here on the screen, you see some photos from my fieldwork. So this started out by me doing research in 2010 with a collective of people working across the arts and technology who happened to start China's first hackerspace. And I've ever since traced the proliferation of making and ideas of DIY hacking in China. So this took me from Shanghai and Beijing and other cities who started China's first maker fairs and hackerspaces, also to the city of Shenzhen, where I joined in 2013 the Accelerator Incubator program that I mentioned earlier. So I joined as an ethnographer and followed a startup as they were moving from an idea into production, and also ended up spending a lot of time in factories over the last 3 years. And I can talk more in the Q&A about my method, and if people want to delve more into sort of the specific projects I've been doing the last 5 years, I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later. But I want to introduce you next to this person. This is Eric Pan. This is a photo of him in 2008 when he was 26 years old. At that time, Eric Pan quit his job as an electrical engineer at Intel in Chengdu, Sichuan, and moved to Beijing, where some of his friends in the arts and design needed help implementing the electronic wiring and networking of the interactive art installations. And some of the artists, to Eric's surprise, had gone quite far on their own to actually work out some of the basic engineering components of the interactive pieces. And what they were all using, Eric discovered, was a small electronics board about the size of a hand called the Arduino. Can I get another showing of hands who has worked with the Arduino before? Okay, quite a few people, so I don't need to explain in too much detail. But in a nutshell, the Arduino is an open source microcontroller platform that came out of a collective project at the Ivrea Design School only 2 years before Eric Pan encountered it in Beijing. The Arduino is very often considered one of the cornerstone key platforms that enabled the spread of the maker movement, enabled people to tinker with not only software, but also with hardware. So the idea was by lowering the costs of hardware, which the Arduino did, and making it open source, many people who might not necessarily have an engineering background, for example, designers and artists, could now also do hardware. And so Eric Pan reflected on this with me in an interview in 2013, saying it was incredible to see the designers were becoming engineers, because with open source, the barrier of entry was tremendously lowered. Everybody could be an engineer and make technology based on their own ideas. And yet, a fundamental hurdle seemed to remain, Eric noticed. Many people still relied on the support of professional engineers and manufacturers to actually complete their work and to move from prototype into a finished art installation or into a finished product. And it was then when Eric Pan had an idea. What if we brought together the power of open source hardware with the expertise and capacity of Chinese manufacturing, he told me. What would happen then? And it was this idea of bringing together China's expertise in manufacturing with what had become widely known as the rise of a new generation of technological hackers and tinkers, Arduino boards, and the maker movement that it gave rise to. So it was this idea of bringing together these two different cultures of making, one the hobby, one professional, that gave rise to a new business idea. And so in 2008, Eric Pan started Seed Studio. So similar to Arduino, Seed Studio actually makes open source hardware platforms and maker kits. But in addition, it also offers services for makers and hardware entrepreneurs who want to move from open source hardware tinkering into commercial production. So while Eric had initially actually tried to start this business in Beijing, the company began really thriving when Eric actually moved to Shenzhen. And this is then when only a couple of months later, after Eric had moved to Shenzhen, the company, at that time a two-people business, released its first product, the Seedwino, which you see here on the right. So the Seedwino was built on the Arduino, but extended it in very important ways. It offered additional features, such as a smaller USB connector, a smaller external power, a switch to manually select the power source, and other add-ons that improved the performance and usability of the Arduino board. And furthermore, this new board, the Seedwino, was offered at a lower price. So it was 20% cheaper than the Arduino board on the market at that time. So the combination of quality improvement and lowered price was crucial for those advocating the spread of making, the proliferation for many who might not otherwise have access to making and afford complicated hardware tinkering. So the main premise of the maker movement is sort of this making available, right, and proliferating it, and the Seedwino really symbolized that. So Seed Studio had begun to what the company should later call hack Shenzhen's electronic supply chain. That is, by building partnerships with factories, with traders, with assembly lines, vendors, and component producers in Shenzhen, Seed Studio had opened up what remained to many a black box of manufacturing. So while the Arduino had lowered the barriers of entry for people to tinker with prototyping and hardware, Seed Studio further extended this approach and additionally also lowered the barriers of entry to move from prototyping into manufacturing. And so Seed's business model is really structured around this idea of partnership, so between manufacturing and making, as I already said. And that has proved quite successful. So the company grew within only 1 year from a two-people business to $100 million industry, to a $100 million company. And the company also had made a name for itself. So many people, especially in US and European maker circles, think of Seedwino as a high-quality project that builds on the ideas of open source hardware sharing and peer production. And yet, Seed appeared all but what people in the West typically expect from a Chinese company. So this is a quote from Eric in an interview with me, where he said, "When I came to the US in 2010, people there knew us and liked our products, but nobody wanted to believe that we are a Chinese company. Nobody had thought that cool and innovative products could come out of China. That's why ever since we have been using Innovate with China on our product labels to demonstrate that manufacturing in China can mean partnership and innovation rather than just cheap and low quality production." And so the company replaced on their products the common Made in China label with an Innovate with China label, as you see here on the screen. And for Eric, this was really a kind of way to demonstrate that manufacturing in China can mean something else than most people are sort of like it's typically associating with it. But Seed Studio then began not just producing maker kits and open source hardware platforms like the Seedwino, it also started producing a variety of other artifacts. So this, for example, is a map. It's called the Shenzhen Map for Makers that Seed Studio released to sort of give people who come for the first time to Shenzhen, people who are not very familiar with the city, a sort of immediate sort of grasp of where you might want to go if you actually want to engage with local factories. So you see here a map of the city. Again, as I said, it's just north of Hong Kong. And then the map actually zooms in here into a part of the city that is enlarged here, and these are the electronic markets of Shenzhen. It's a 15 by 15 city block area filled with department store buildings, in turn filled with vendors and components, traders and producers. And it's a place where many of the makers who come for the first time to Shenzhen go, because this is where they told me they can get a feel of manufacturing in China right away, where you can touch things and look at components and see how they work. And this is one of the people who came through the work of Seed Studio to Shenzhen. So this is Zach Smith. He's the co-founder of MakerBot. Many of you might be familiar with MakerBot. It was one of the earlier open source 3D printers that later went closed source. Very controversial in the maker scene. But this is Zach here standing in the Huaqiangbei markets and calling it in an interview with me later, Shenzhen is like living in a city-sized tech shop again, which gives this sort of sense of like, here making and manufacturing and fabrication is right at your fingertips, and the whole city is a fabric of making. So I wanted to show you though what has happened over the years in Huaqiangbei and in Shenzhen, with people moving there and Shenzhen remaking itself as this sort of Silicon Valley for hardware. So you see here on the left a photo that I took of the Huaqiangbei markets, electronic markets, a year ago. And I was just back in December, and this is how it looks like today. Or similarly here, I want to draw your attention to this tiny teapot here on the right. This is how these stalls look like today. There is a tea table. It's the same people working there, but it's clearly upgraded. It gives a very different vibe and feel. One of the first things one notices when coming to the Huaqiangbei market in Shenzhen is this building. This is the SEG Market, named after the Shenzhen Electronics Group that owns the building. This building was actually one of the first buildings of Shenzhen and the electronics industry. So it was built in 1986, and it was a conglomerate of 54 enterprises, mostly focused on circuit board and component production for end consumer electronics. And it, in that sense, is one of the first marketplaces of the city. This building and the market it represents features frequently in all kinds of stories I hear from people in Shenzhen. So all the way from those who arrived in the 80s and who are in the manufacturing industry in Shenzhen, all the way to newcomers like Zach, who frequently go there to find components. At the bottom of this iconic building is a new icon, is a new 10-meter long, 3-meter high concrete sign that reads the following in both English and Chinese. So it says in English, Shenzhen, Huaqiangbei, cradle for entrepreneurs, paradise for starting a business. And so important to note here, though, is that the Chinese term, 壮客, which you see here, was actually translated as entrepreneur. So the term 壮客 was actually coined by people like Eric Pan and other Chinese makers in 2011 when they wanted to distinguish themselves from connotations of hacking and illegal sort of hacking into a system. And so they coined the term 壮客. And 壮客sort of has the benefit of connoting many things. It could connote creativity, innovation, also entrepreneurship, but the government currently translates it as entrepreneurship. So this is not simply just a negligent glitch by a translator, it's quite a purposeful use of the word. And so what happened just recently, so this was back in January 2015, the Prime Minister of China, Li Keqiang, visited one of the local hackerspaces, the first hackerspace of Shenzhen, Chaihuo. And there he meets Eric. It's hard to see, here he meets Eric and some of the other makers. And he's so excited by what he sees that he returns to Beijing, and just a couple of weeks later declares a new national policy that now incorporates the term making and into sort of a policy that now envisions a growth of what you could loosely translate as a mass makerspace, mass entrepreneurship, or mass innovation. And so by setting up makerspaces across China and by retraining China's existing workforce, this new policy stipulates people could adopt an entrepreneurial mindset, an innovation thinking approach that could help proliferate entrepreneurship beyond the set of a privileged few, but be adopted by literally masses of people. This, of course, comes at an opportune moment as the Chinese economy, especially when you look at Western media outlets, is slowing down. You know, that's been in the news quite a bit. So actually, you know, supporting entrepreneurship as a mode to deal with an economic slowdown is also really a strategy here that the government is currently deploying. But for sure, this is not just unique to China. You know, we've also seen this similar in the United States. So this is President Barack Obama when he's visiting a digital fabrication lab in 2013 in Ohio. And you know, where he actually declares digital fabrication and the maker movement as a way to guarantee that the next revolution in manufacturing is made in America. And you see something very similar in Europe, which is there called Industry 4.0, or the reindustrialization of Europe, where techniques like the digitization, the use of Arduino and Raspberry Pi, and so these kind of digital physical prototyping platforms are used and envisioned to upgrade existing industries. But coming back to Shenzhen, in just one sentence then, this signage here summarizes the city's much larger project of upgrading existing industries and infrastructures like Huatiangbei by cultivating the model of entrepreneurship, and really also signaling here how much it is embedded in a much larger global discourse around entrepreneurship. But certainly needed a policy, nor this signage did come out of nowhere. And in part in this talk, I really want to show you how the work of people like Eric and others really led to some of this adoption of making as a form of entrepreneurship. So in June 2014, the SAG Market, who I showed you earlier, the image of this iconic building in Shenzhen, opened its own makerspace. So now, you can access electronic components and negotiate with vendors and repair workers, but you can also tinker with 3D printers and laser cutters and so on. This here is the woman behind this effort. This is Shirley Feng. She came to Shenzhen in her 20s. She started out by working actually in the call center and slowly began working her way up by becoming a partner in several manufacturing businesses. Shenzhen is now her home and where her family lives. And she's also the director of the Shenzhen Industrial Design Association, which she co-founded in 2008. And Shirley Feng, and in her role as director of the Industrial Design Association, has been crucial in establishing the city as a city of design, dating all the way back to 2008 when she started this work. So in 2008, Shenzhen actually became a city of design as part of the UNESCO Creative Cities network, and Shirley Feng was very instrumental to that. But Shirley Feng has also been doing other things. She's been hosting a series of events, from conferences to industrial design fairs, to designing the future events, to fairs that are now bridging actually between a longer history of industrial design and the maker movement. So this is actually a photo of the 2014 Industrial Design Fair, where Seed Studio now also has a booth. So she has been doing this very important work of actually bridging a longer history of industrial design with the maker kind of movement initiatives. And Shirley is now also a key advocate of the maker movement itself. So she was actually the one who sponsored the maker movement, the maker fair in 2015. So there was heavy government investment in the maker fair. And it was also the government who actually built the whole district where the maker fair was actually hosted. And then the maker fair in part enabled also the revitalization of that new district. So these are images of that new, so this didn't exist 6 months before the maker fair. So these are some images, glossy high-rise buildings, parks that are labeled to help people start a new business. There's apartments for workers, which should again attract a new kind of clientele to these kinds of city neighborhoods. But the history of city itself also figures as a central protagonist in all of this. It is not insignificant that the hopes for China's future rest again on Shenzhen and the south of China. So Shenzhen was declared a special economic zone in 1979 and constituted a key site in the post-Mao economic experimentation and China's national reform of opening up. So this is a photo of Deng Xiaoping during his 1982 tour to the south, where he inscribed the name of Sea World for Shikou, this crucial port of the city of Shenzhen. And this was significant and remains significant until today. So anthropologist Marion O'Donnell, for example, describes this moment as when Deng Xiaoping inscribed the characters of SeaWorld, he not only signaled his support for the Shiko model, which was the port model, the opening up of China, the opening of an economic growth model for China, he also made the kinds of reforms that were taking place in Shiko a model for national development. So Shenzhen itself, with its model of opening up, became a model for China as a whole and for its opening up and economic reform that should come later. Such histories of openness and rapid economic development are often invoked today to portray Shenzhen, then as now, as an entrepreneurial city, a city of opportunities. Stories of Shenzhen as a migrant city, a city that belongs to everyone who decides to move there. So Shenzhen really grew with it becoming a special economic zone. It's now a 22 million people city, but before it actually was a special economic zone, it became that manufacturing hub we know of it today. It only had 15,000 people. It was mostly doing agricultural production. So these stories of Shenzhen being an entrepreneurial place, a place where China can experiment and remake itself, are told over and over again today to craft a particular kind of origin story, one in line with the making of Shenzhen as a hub of contemporary technological innovation and entrepreneurship. So Shenzhen's population, as already hinted at, comes from elsewhere. More than 95% of the city's population is migrants. And it is not only the promise of a better income, but the hopes for a different future that motivates hundreds of migrant workers every year to seek employment in Shenzhen, often far away from their families. And this is one person who I've been following for many years now, Yike Wu. He's the manager of a tablet company, who is one of the few people who came to Shenzhen to make it, and he's also one of the few people who actually did make it. So his company now has a revenue of several million US dollars every year, shipping tablets to South America, to Europe, to Russia, and also to the United States. So it's kind of the devices you can buy, for example, at Walmart or Target. And Wu originally came to Shenzhen at the urging of a relative who was working at the Chinese car manufacturer Build Your Dream. So Build Your Dream, that's the name of the company, gave out stipends for people to get scholarships. And Yike Wu took that opportunity and came to Shenzhen. But then he made very quickly a name for himself in the local manufacturing industries by leading a development team that produced a tablet that was introduced into the Chinese market before Apple had officially released its new iPad in the United States. And also looks fairly similar. This did not go by unnoticed by bigger players in the local manufacturing industry. And Wu explained and told me later then that once he had released that product, he had also gained trust and made a name for himself and quickly found partners in the local industry who would invest in him. And he then puts this later as, they're describing Shenzhen, there's no other place like this in China. Here you can find lots of opportunities, you can become yourself, you can realize your dream, you can make a story out of your life. So stories of self-actualization like Yike Wu's are frequently invoked when people speak of the promise that making holds for China today. So this here is Ed from Intel presenting at the same Shenzhen Maker Fair I was showing you earlier. So Ed was actually involved in the making of Edison, which is one of Intel's key open source hardware platforms that they are hoping will also help Intel be a key platform for the maker movement and for the open source hardware, people in open source hardware. And in his talk here at the Maker Fair, Ed was riffing off of Chris Anderson's infamous notion of the long tail, as you can see here on his slide, that stipulates that the future of technology production rests on people like Yike Wu or people like you, rather than big corporations. He then invited Yike Wu on stage. So here you see, it's a little bit dark, you see Yike Wu again, and who then goes on to demonstrate to the audience of makers, of entrepreneurs, government officials, how he can help them to move from hobby into entrepreneurship. Yike demonstrates in this talk, he knows the inner workings of contemporary technology. He knows how to manufacture almost anything. And what we see on display here is a story of individual empowerment that has become quite pervasive in maker rhetoric, and that masks the neoliberal logic behind the lure of hope and excitement over the potentials of a truly democratized technology production. Those who make get ahead, and those who don't are left behind. And remember, I told you Yi Ke-woo is actually one of the few people who has managed to make it and move up in his career there. So I draw here from Gina Neff's work, where she has articulated, well, knowledge work had sort of turned the individual into an entrepreneur, and I'm quoting her here as an ideology. Risk-taking provides a rationalization for economic stratification that is almost as powerful and complete as the idea of meritocracy. Those who take risks get ahead, and those who don't are left behind. And I see something very similar happening right now with making turned entrepreneurship itself into a mode of living. And so what I want to argue for here, and what I hopefully have shown today, is that making itself has become deeply intertwined with the cultivation of and contestation of a mode of entrepreneurial living. So what I mean by this is that the call for a do-it-yourself and hands-on attitude in much maker-related work in China, as much as in the United States, for example, was aimed at the cultivation of a self that not only reckoned with this new normal, but also intervened in it. Making is about reworking who and what gets to shape contemporary society, technology, and the economy. Makers, in other words, took social and technological matters into their own hands. And so making, in this sense, was positioned as a socio-technical intervention into the status quo. And exactly because of this commitment to the concrete and to unpacking the inner workings of technologies, making also described and prescribed an attainable future, something to hold on to as the world appeared at the end of times, to quote Zizek here. So what I wonder then, is this what China's makers had in mind? Is this what Eric Pan had in mind when he started out in 2008 in Shenzhen and was aspiring towards Shenzhen and manufacturing to be seen as a partner, as an innovate with China? Yes and no. Rather than this upgrading of Shenzhen, this entrepreneurializing of Shenzhen that I've shown you today, Eric wanted China itself to be taken seriously as a site that could make us rethink what innovation means in the first place. So in many ways, challenging that innovation is necessarily something that originates in the West, and asking people to think through what else innovation could mean. And so I want to, in the last couple of minutes of my talk, show you what China's makers actually had in mind. So this here is a photo of David Lee. I've been working with David Lee for many, many years. He's the co-founder of China's first hackerspace, that opened in Shanghai in 2010. I was with them as an ethnographer and field worker at that time during my dissertation research. And this here is David a couple of years later holding up what he calls the Book of Shanzhai. And the Book of Shanzhai is, for David, the quintessential example of what else innovation could mean that's not necessarily a Western-centric model. So let me explain. So Shanzhai translates into English as mountain stronghold or mountain fortress, and connotes an informal outlaw tradition. The term has been used in China for a long time and features most prominently in folk stories like the Shui Hu Zhuan, which is the book that David here holds in his hands. So the book tells the adventures of 108 rebels who hide in the mountains and fight the establishment. So Shanzhai is the story of outlaws who have gone away to the mountains, doing things on their own terms. There's an element of criminality about Shanzhai, just the way that Robin Hood is a little bit of an outlaw. But it's really about autonomy, about independence, and very progressive survival techniques. So the term Shanzhai was first applied to manufacturing in the 1950s to describe small-scale family-run factories in Hong Kong that produced cheap, low-quality household items in order to mark their position outside of the official economic order. So think about the copycat Nike or Gucci bag or Nike shoes. So they produced these counterfeit products of well-known brands, and the term Shanzhai was applied because they took from the rich and established, from Gucci, from the big brands, and made these brands affordable and give it to the poor. As electronics production moved to Shenzhen, Shanzhai was applied to account for these kinds of creations that came out of Shenzhen about 10 years later. So this, on the screen, what you see here are actually mobile phones. So this one on the right is a mobile phone that's also a flashlight and a radio. And this is a mobile phone that's shaped like an alcohol bottle. And the other one is like a comic character. Or this one is one of my favorites. It's shaped like an apple. All of these are actually found in the electronic markets of Huoqiangbei, the electronic markets introduced you to earlier. And all of these devices were actually made in a very similar way. So in my research, I investigated a little bit, and I found that all of these devices are rooted in an open manufacturing building system. So what you see here on the screen is the reference board that goes into producing a smartwatch. So this reference board is actually open source in Shenzhen. So you can access the bill of materials that goes into producing this board. You can take the board and the bill of materials and all the list of components that comes with it and make your own smartwatch. You can slightly modify it, or you can just take it as is and attach your own shell to it and make your own smartwatch. So this is basically how the manufacturing of all of these devices that I've shown you earlier works. So people sometimes take the same board, add a different shell, and design a phone for a new niche market. So the idea is that these phones are designed for people who cannot afford a smartphone, for example. Most of these came out a couple of years ago. So the idea was designing cool and interesting phones for people who don't have access to, like, let's say, an Apple iPhone, for example. More recently, a lot of these products, so this has been going on for the last 8 years, are also specifically designed for other markets. So this is a phone that's designed specifically for Africa. Technomobile is the company behind it that grew out of Shenzhen and this open manufacturing system I was just describing. It's now one of the biggest brands in Africa. And the phone is in many ways unique because it comes with a camera feature that can capture dark-skinned subjects very well. And this is something that the company uses in their marketing strategy to clearly indicate how much they are positioning this device for a particular market in Africa. So China's makers like David and Eric Pan frequently reference these examples of Shanzhai production to ask this question: why is the Arduino considered open source, and why is the manufacturing culture and the open reference design board ecosystem typically described by the West as counterfeit and copycat? So why is one innovative and the other one considered backwards? And they ask the same: why is the Apple iPhone considered a quintessential example of innovation and the other one just a cheap copy? And with this, I would like to end and invite you all for questions. Thank you so much.
So we have plenty of time for questions, so anyone? Yes.
Before I get my question, I thought your analysis of how maker phenomena and entrepreneurial and state agenda is somehow intertwined is very good. What I'm interested in is I interviewed some of the makers in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and they kind of look down on the phenomenon in China as kind of state-driven, which is very much against the hacker maker culture. And also that it's commercially driven, which is in some ways also against the maker culture, or the kind of more orthodox kind of maker culture. So I'm wondering if this discussion is happening in China, or if they are part of the movement that is trying to challenge this kind of commercially driven, entrepreneurially driven, state-driven kind of maker phenomenon.
So yeah, thank you very much for this question. So as part of my research, I've been traveling quite a bit to other parts of Asia, including Taiwan and Hong Kong. So yeah, I'm very familiar with sort of the story, but it's a story that you also hear in China. It's the same story that you also hear many Chinese people say: we need the Silicon Valley model, and we don't need the Shanzhai model, for example. That's backwards. You know, we need to orient towards the West and the United States in particular. So you hear that quite a bit also in China. So from the perspective of the people I've been working with, so the people who have been instrumental in setting up a kind of maker scene in China, so some of the people I've introduced you to today, Eric Pan and David Lee and some of the others, they are very eager to provide alternative narratives and alternative stories. So what they usually would say in situations like this is to say, well, commercialization and making money is not necessarily the opposite of innovation. And so they usually point them to examples from the United States, think about MakerBot, and how much making in the United States is as much about a commercial effort. And that's why the government is in part supporting it. So you see that sort of, endorsement of making because it indicates a particular kind of commercial and industrial approach to upgrade all the industries, to remake citizens and education is exactly why it's so enticing and why there is so much investment, not just by governments, but also from corporations. So Chinese makers like Eric and David come in and say, well, how can we intervene within that, right? Yes, it is already commercial, but that doesn't mean it's the opposite of interesting. But how could we intervene in how that commercial is being done? So a lot of the people like David and Eric and others, are really aspirational in that sense that they want to intervene in sort of how some of these things get funded. They think VC models and the Silicon Valley model is very harmful to actually sustaining this business in the long term. So their big goal is to actually say, yes, commercial is fine, we all need to make money. But how to make money? How could we rethink that? And how could we remake that? So that would be their response to some of it.
Well, I guess one getting that is part of maker culture is trying to challenge the kind of the capitalist commercialized kind of production by doing things yourself.
In its rhetoric, yeah.
Its rhetoric, and in well, not just in rhetoric, a lot of actual things that are going on that there's trying to kind of get away, from. I think there's a part of it that is more about sharing, more about an open source and sharing of knowledge, resources, material, and so forth, which in some way could be commercialized, but there's elements of it that is.
Well, it already is commercialized, right? So I mean, even when you think about some of these key examples in open source hardware in the United States, or in Taiwan and across regions, right? There is a real drive towards commercialization, right? But I think sort of your question comes from this place. So yes, so making, when you look at sort of like the flyers of, Maker Faire and sort of Make Media, or people who built the first hackerspaces, there's a real ethos of saying this is about tinkering, this is about intervening in passive consumption, this is about intervening in that Apple tells us what to use, we make our own infrastructures and resources. And what I've tried to argue for with this term of entrepreneurial living is to say that in and of itself is on the one hand, yes, an intervention into how we live and work and who gets to decide, but it also feeds into the story where I'm building off of Gina's work here, feeds into the story that all of us, in order to be successful, have to learn how to do that on our own. We have to become these entrepreneurial subjects in order to be successful, to be a self-making, self-actualizing citizen. So it's both, it's told as a story of empowerment, and yet that story of empowerment remains largely exclusive. And reserved for people who have access to spaces like hacker spaces, who can afford to go there in their free time. And so it helps proliferate, on the one hand, through a story of hope and empowerment, also a neoliberal ethos that extends this notion that it is on you and on the individual to remake your own education, to make your own devices, to make your own work, and so on.
I want to just pick up on where you're going with that, because what I didn't hear in this talk is play. And I love this concept of entrepreneurial living, and I think you're onto something really smart there. I wonder, and I feel comfortable saying to you, because I know you know maker space writ large, not just the case of China, to what extent is there a comparison that you can make about recapturing work through play in some economies and some approaches to making, and perhaps a different way that it plays out in China, right? That this idea of entrepreneurial living, does does the playfulness get lost in the Chinese context?
So, okay, I have two answers to that. Thank you very much. So play is very, very important. And a lot of the people involved in, were involved in setting up the first makerspaces in China, and Eric Pan, focus centrally on play. So if you actually go to the Seed Studio website, or if you go to the Seed Studio offices in Shenzhen, they're highly playful. And for Eric and many others in that space, the goal here is to actually build an organizational culture that is radically different of what they consider the norm to be in China. And so they see this kind of like the association we have with making and tinkering as sort of like play and informality as a way to intervene into how work is done in China. And so play is actually very, very important also in China. It's interesting though because so the big maker fairs in Shenzhen are usually attended by makers from China, by investors from all over, but also by a lot of makers, of course, from other parts of the world. And I've been part of numerous conversations and debates where people, especially from makers from the United States and Europe, would say things like, why is this all about commercial activity here? And this is not what we wanted with the Maker Fair in the Bay Area. And they would point to, like, when you go to the Maker Fair in the Bay Area, you see these cupcake cars, for example, where people build cars that look like a cupcake and they ride around, and you see these sort of crazy vehicles, and there's no immediate commercial purpose visible. It's very purposefully displayed as play and funky and crazy, right? And when you go to the Shenzhen Maker Fair, you see, for example, an open source vehicle that looks almost like a finished car. So it's almost a product, right? And it doesn't give off this image of play. And so on first glance, right, the two seem starkly opposed, and the reaction that usually, Chinese makers then get is like, well, this is, this is not what we had in mind. This is not innovative because you're just doing another product. And so I think what is important here is to recognize how these different forms of making and hacking and open source hardware practices are culturally and historically situated, right? So when you think about making so we very often think about making and hacking as a counterculture, right? So the important question then is to ask, counter to what? So as I said earlier, right, making and hacking in the United States is very often positioned as counter to passive consumer culture, as counter to intervening in the corporate monopoly. Now in China, it is very much the position as counter to stable hierarchies, as counter to top-down decision-making, as counter to an image of China that's about low-quality production. So if you think about it, if you wanted to theorize making in China as a counterculture, it's the counter and intervening into how production is done, into how work is performed in China, and who gets to make decisions in China about product lines, and that's how, and then when you look at it from that specifically situated context of making, that actually looks quite playful in the context of China, right? So I would say, it's really interesting how people draw on these different narratives, but how they play out so differently and culturally situated. And then on first glance, they just seem to misalign, and then it leads to these misunderstandings, right? Where people are like, wait, this is not what we wanted in the first place.
And those practices of work may actually have more analogies than we might see at first glance.
Yes.
So we'll pick that one up.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and then so now, and that is why, so many, Dale Doherty, is sort of the more prominent figure in the space, but many makers, from the United States now being and living in Shenzhen, or at least temporarily, to actually work with factories there, right? And they actually perceive, Huaqiangbei as also this sort of very playful kind of, they're romanticizing it in many ways, right? A lot of people are complaining now about the upgrading of the Huaqiangbei markets because they're less messy now, and the Huaqiangbei markets used to look like a big hacker space. They were messy, there was food, there were families, now they're much cleaner, right? So that is, so people are now saying, well, now this upgrading that's happening in the government's quest to look like a Silicon Valley for hardware, a lot of that informal manufacturing culture is also being, changed in terms of how it looks and how it feels. And that's again what then China's makers are saying, we don't want that sort of copying of Silicon Valley that changes our infrastructures in the markets, for example, to change. That's not what we had in mind. That's not what we wanted. Yes.
I'm wondering about the sort of relationship to the brand of Make. That's that's cultivated in Shenzhen versus, say, Silicon Valley, where you have a lot of resistance, right, to even thinking of the word making, just because of how heavily, identified it is as a tech company that O'Reilly has fostered. So is there any recognition of that history, of like that legacy, sort of O'Reilly in particular, and American tech culture in the term make, and how is that responded to?
Yeah, so I mean, O'Reilly probably less so. I think there's less engagement specifically with that, but that Dale Doherty was invited as the keynote speaker for China's first featured maker fair was very, very strategic, right? And that was strategic for two reasons: was to signal to what people believe to be this global maker movement, to signal to that people invested in that China is also part of this now, right? And we have the founder of Make Media here at our fair, but it was also really important to legitimize what they were doing in China. So government support came only after the first Maker Fair. So Chris Anderson was invited, Tom Igo from Argentina was invited. They all gave keynote speeches. They were invited to meet with government officials. So all of that, the brand, the Western brand behind Make, gave legitimacy to the effort in China. And you see that not just in this case, this is something that's quite pervasive in China, where people attempt to make international alliances and connections in part to legitimize their work in China, because it builds trust through a brand, for example. So making that was quite strategically used. But on the other hand, even before China's first featured maker fairs were hosted, the people who had grouped around China's first hackerspaces actually started their own fairs. They were called maker carnivals, and they didn't use the English term maker, they used the Chinese term 创客 that I mentioned earlier. And this was really about getting people together in China, and so there was actually, in part it is really difficult in China to set up a large gathering of people through a foreign organization. So what people did with hosting these first maker events that weren't the maker fairs, they actually worked with the China Communist Youth League, which is an organization that is part of the government and that has hosted DIY crafts conferences and workshops and fairs for many, many years. And so they basically built on that lineage to, again, get out the word of 创客. And that work was actually so important because in part it's what brought that term 创客to sort of like into a broader vernacular. It's now used all over, right? And in part, the Prime Minister's endorsement, Li Keqiang's endorsement, is very much so drawing on all that legwork and that articulation work that had happened through these smaller events, for many, many years. So branding, very important, but again, it's a complicated relationship there. Yes.
A couple of questions picking up on a couple of threads you've already started in the Q&A. First, you talked about maker and entrepreneurship being written into the new national policy. So can you talk a little bit more about what that policy actually is? Is it about subsidizing this economy or providing infrastructure? So what is the actual policy? And second is, in this kind of new maker economy, have you been able to see so far signs of inequality and what that looks like or what that might look like in the future as this sort of continues?
It's a great question. So the policy came out, as I said earlier, in 2015, but it really builds on a series of policies that have come before. And a lot of this started actually with China entering the WTO in 2001. And this was a time when China began partnering with international advisors, especially from Australia and the UK, to develop a creative industry policy framing for the country. And so it started in 2001. There were a series of policies that came out that initiated sort of like concrete steps to move China from made in China to created in China. And this had very, specific ramifications. For example, Shanghai had a whole building initiative between 2004 and 2008 where they turned old factories and old buildings into so-called creative industry clusters. And these buildings are now, in part, you see incubators there and co-working spaces and maker spaces and architecture firms and boutiques. It was very much sort of, remaking of Shenzhen, the remaking of China through a creative industry policy. Now, what you see happening with the more recent policies is that there's a slight shift happening. So there's no emphasis anymore so centrally on this move away from made in China. It's a strong endorsement of entrepreneurship, and it's a strong endorsement or kind of a, let's say, a sort of approach towards mobilizing this to impact many, many people. So before, there was this kind of notion of like, we need to build up creative spaces, we need to train citizens to become creative knowledge producers. So it was very much the drawing on theories of the knowledge economy, the creative society, these policy advisors that came in from the UK and Australia were literally drawing on Richard Florida and theories like that, right? So there was a kind of coming, you could almost say, I mean, that's my own interpretation of these policy documents, a kind of coming to terms with that that's not on a scale, which you also see in many ways here in the United States, right? And so making also here and in China's position as this like intervention into what the creative and knowledge economy didn't deliver, right? It's saying, well, so making the narrative is to proliferate it beyond, just a set of privilege. Everyone can be a maker. Everybody is a maker, right? Is the slogan of the Maker Fair, right? So it's this idea that everyone is empowered to do that. You don't have to be a specially trained person. You don't have to have high education. Everyone is doing that. And very often you see Maker Fairs also a celebration of craftsmen, of the worker. A lot of people who come to Shenzhen, it's almost like, they go to factories and celebrate what they see and actually overlook labor inequality and don't really mention that, because there's this like, yeah, see, they're making, that's what we've lost in the United States, for example, right? And so the government is in part with the policy, not quite articulating some of that, but it's a very strong focus of saying, we need to worry about employment over the next year. So there's rising college unemployment, that's a serious problem, and so they see that maker entrepreneurship model as a way to intervene. Okay, so this was the answer to your first question. And then the second was about inequality, right? And so I already sort of mentioned that as well, right? So there's, in this, what you see with regards to this upgrading of Shenzhen, for example, in particular, that it's stigmatizing an informal economy. So remember I mentioned about Shanghai, right? So all of this, is considered something that China needs to get rid of. So the government does not support companies like this. The government supports companies like Seed Studio. But it considers things like that as not in line with this trajectory of heading towards the Silicon Valley for hardware. And so so what has happened in some of these companies now is that advisors from the government go into these corporations and tell them how to go IPO, tell them how to upgrade and train their workforces to become innovative thinkers, and adopt, again, this more venture capital, Silicon Valley type model of innovation. And that leaves behind a lot of people, right? And also dismantles actually really rich informal economy that has been working and has actually built the city into what it is today. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the material nature of this being hardware. And the early quote that you put up about software coming out of Silicon Valley and hardware coming out of Shenzhen. What is it about, so making things physically here in the US and the maker movement is often presented as a way to access and get back in touch with that self-actualized self. But it sounds like the entrepreneurial self that you're putting forward is more of about making it and making it successfully. And so can you talk about, in your research, how the process of making itself has also been talked about? What does it do for the people that are participating in it, other than this achievement of success? Or is that not something that's part of the rhetoric?
That's a great question. So I really liked what you were saying about, question of like making it and making things and getting sort of in touch with the hardware. So a couple of things. I mean, I do see a very strong narrative that's very much so, through the making of things, there is the making of the self, right? And that's very much so Eric Pahn's story. Eric Pahn is celebrated as one of the key success stories. He was featured as one of China's 30 under 30, Forbes China in like 2 years ago. And he's now also part of a advisory board committee to the government, where people like Alibaba and others advise the government on how to move forward for technology development. So yeah, there's this kind of making of individual careers, of the self through the making of things and of hardware and of products, right? And Shenzhen is very strategically positioned there as hardware. I mean, you were referencing the Choi Itu quote, right? Of like, well, in Palo Alto they know how to make software, right? And here they know how to make hardware. And that's what a lot of the investors who come in, you know, from Europe and from the United States are articulating when they say, well, this is yet another resource to tap, right? This is where there's so much value that's not being tapped yet, right? And so there's this sort of like the making of money, the making of value, the making of the self, and the making of the city, right? It's all intertwined. And so in part I've been trying and attempting to theorize that, you know, what is in that intertwining and entanglement, how can you, so I'm trying to do my analysis almost like to take a cut, you know, to use Marilyn Strathern's term, and look at, you know, what is entangled and who is left out of some of these entanglements and what sticks together and what might fall out of that, right? But yeah, it's very, so that sort of, I don't even think you could separate the making of the self from this kind of, from a celebration of making hardware being that next, you know, that next era of technological innovation. And in part, I mean, for me, the question is, how is that lived, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at also with the sort of entrepreneurial living term. How is it actually lived? What does it mean for Eric on a day-to-day basis to do that, right? And there's a lot of ambivalences in that. So Eric is not just on the advisory board now that consults the government in where to move in the future with regards to technology. He is also being visited by government officials, the company itself, on a regular basis. And it's highly stressful because there's always that threat in China that you might be shut down tomorrow, and people are articulating that, right? If their work is suddenly not quite in line with what the government has in mind. And so these visits are always high-stake visits to his office. And so there's a lot of ambivalence in that, you know, making yourself through the kind of company you're building. And Eric usually refers to it as like, we are currently riding a big wave, but it's unclear when the wave, you know, will fall down. It might happen tomorrow. And it's this sort of image, I find it imagery powerful because it speaks to that instability of like, imagine yourself on a surfboard on a wave, like it's like really scary, you know? And so it's kind of that metaphor that speaks to the sort of, you know, high stakes actually for you personally and for the company you're building and the people you're employing. Yeah, it's a great question.
I'd like to ask a question following up on that. So as you and I talked about last night, there's some things I've been reading on the tightening of governmental controls, even in the last few months, on content producers in various media, but especially in digital media. And it's clear to me what, you know, I mean, I understand what kinds of threats content producers might be perceived as posing. I don't understand what kinds of threats makers can be perceived as posing.
And they're not considered a threat. It's not at all right now, right? So the government is very strongly endorsing it.
But when Eric gets visited by government officials snooping around, sniffing,
Yeah.
what are they asking, or are they just signaling we're still in charge, watching you? Like,
Well,
that's the part
yes.
I get.
So it's never clearly articulated, or not very often, but it's kind of signaling. Yes, there's somebody involved in, you know, exerting control to a degree. And what is, but again, you know, making has received a lot of endorsement, a lot of money behind it right now in China. It's not considered threatening, like a lot of the content producers are. It's considered something that's in line with official policy. And it's in some ways exactly because, you know, makers have been actually using some of these, like Chuangke really signals that, right? Chuangke, the term, signals the alignment with official discourse because it connotes innovation. And so it's a very safe term. And again, sort of the ambitions are to intervene and from within, you know, which I find really interesting because it's not an outright resistance culture, you know, but it's still, and yet, you know, it's still always this sort of notion of you don't quite know what might happen tomorrow. And in many ways, you know, and this has been theorized by many China studies scholars on censorship, you know, but it's so powerful that censorship in China is in part its ambivalence, that you don't know what is okay to say tomorrow. And that's the big power, right? There's so much self-censorship happening because you don't know what the rules are. And that's the same situation here, right? It seems all great today, and people feel excited about that, and there's financial support, but there's also this real ambivalence about, what might that mean tomorrow? And again, the international collaborations are really important for people because, again, they help legitimize their work. So there's very often the alignment with international partners in that space, especially Silicon Valley, because it gives the credibility to actually avoid, to signal this is something you want to. Yes.
I thought the comparison you made with the makers in the US doing the cupcake cart versus a finished electric car was interesting, but I'm wondering how much of that is actual difference in mindset versus difference in the actual material ecosystem that's available to them, because you're basically, in China, you're basically in that area, you're in the place where all the consumer electronics are assembled and you have every component you want. And in the US, you have to buy a finished product and take it apart sometimes to get that one component. And so, like, is there really that much of a difference between the people, what they're doing in those locations, or is it just kind of what they're able to do?
Yeah, so in part I've been trying to show also how actually people from various regions come together, both on hobbyist play projects and on commercial projects, right? So you see a lot of commercial projects right now coming out of that open source making, going manufacturing route that is by Western startups. So it's not that there's like an inherent mindset that prohibits, I'm not trying to say that at all, right? An inherent mindset that prohibits Westerners from doing that, and that, there's a Chinese mindset that allows to do it. I think in many ways, that's really being challenged by some of what we see here. But I think, it's exactly that sort of, Shenzhen sort of as it is, that ecosystem. It's literally also described as an ecosystem by people who are working there, right? To say, yes, this is, as I was saying, this is where fabrication and production is at your fingertips, right? Where you can actually move from an idea into production in a couple of months. So a lot of these phones I was showing you earlier, they're very quickly produced. They usually go from idea into production within like 4 weeks. They're not necessarily always designed to last, they're very affordable and cheap and for specific niche markets. And it's exactly because of that, right, that people partner. And so actually the open source vehicle that I was mentioning was actually a partnership between an Italian company and a Shenzhen-based manufacturer. So what you see a lot there is a real challenging of any of these binaries, that there's some sort of inherent mindset or an inherent sort of essence of Chineseness that would allow the commercial manufacturing versus the inherent essence of Americans would be played. So it's really challenging a lot of these binaries in very important ways, I think.
So I think I agree with the notion that there probably aren't Chinese mindsets toward entrepreneurship and American mindsets towards entrepreneurship. There is, however, a pretty distinct Chinese intellectual property regime that is soft in the open economic zones. It's really hard in mainland China. It's got an infamous record for stealing from the West and cyber espionage. Could you say something about how and I think national security interests and intellectual property law often create boundaries for maker communities, right? Because in almost every country at some point, a maker does something that gets them in jail or results in enormous fines. Can you say something about how your makers imagine their role in China's intellectual property regime? In some places, so it's not, I don't think there's, the politics that I think they're being worried about are not related to content, but bigger companies coming after them or taking their intellectual property and building something else, right? Because it's such an unstable intellectual property regime.
Okay, a couple of answers to that. So this question always comes up, especially for startups who do work in China. And one of the first questions that most startups are getting is, but aren't you afraid that your idea will be stolen, right? And then what a lot of startups, especially those who come out of the more open source hardware maker kind of movement, would say that even if that was the case, if it was their idea was owned by bigger corporations, they wouldn't win in the end anyway, because they couldn't afford the same kind of lawyer that the big corporation could afford. What they want to do instead, is, and this is something many people active in the maker scene are advocating, is a totally different approach towards innovation, which is actually challenging intellectual property laws and copyright and so on by saying, you know, we want to build on a model of open innovation, of open sharing, of peer production, and we think that is in the long term, in the long run, an alternative to, you know, what we currently have being implemented through, in part, you know, WTO agreements and whatnot. And many people then also point actually to Shanghai and say, well, that's actually an example of what we mean, you know, how you could actually do product design that's rooted in a different kind of business model, that's about partnership, that's about open sharing. And many of them, so for example, there's obviously a lot of tensions and disagreements about this topic also within the maker scene. You know, when you just look at, for example, MakerBot, you know, there's sort of Brie Pettis, you know, who argues for that more corporate made in America kind of approach, even though MakerBot does manufacture in China. And Zach, his co-founder, who idealizes anything making related in China, right? So he sees the Shanghai open source manufacturing culture is a real alternative, and he celebrates that as a model, right? So on the other hand, you know, so many of the makers, let's say, you know, people who align with Zach's kind of idea also align with Shanghai and celebrate it as an alternative. And again, people like Brie Pettis wouldn't, right? And there was just a news stories now of MakerBot actually partnering now with one of the key manufacturers in China again, even though the story is like so much the opposite, right? So there's always that question of like, you know, when it comes to intellectual property, how is one region sort of like, you know, sort of cast as sort of this land of, you know, I would almost say the wild, wild west, you know, and separating it out from what is happening in other regions, and yet that region is fundamentally intertwined with IT production also in the West, right? So it's like a back and forth that we can't really fully disentangle, right? And so the question is, how are people articulating this then? You know, how are people making sense of this and responding to some of these questions when they are asked by venture capitalists and so on? There was something else I wanted to say to that. Oh, yes, right. So the government now, you know, with this sort of like upgrading of Shenzhen and other regions as Silicon Valley for hardware, is very much so actually also promoting, you know, we need to develop a model of intellectual property. And again, it's in alignment with corporate monopolies. It's a supporting of large businesses and actually undercutting this informal economy of small-scale entrepreneurship, which you see, for example, in the Shanghai economy, and is rendering that as backwards, and is something China needs to overcome. And so again, China's makers would point to them and say, well, actually, that's much more harmful. You know, that's actually destroying a vibrant business model. There was a question back there.
So, a lot of things people have said actually made me think of, you know, thinking about other contexts, for example, India, in which there's a lot of this kind of entrepreneurial living, I would say, and I've spent a little bit of time in the kind of medical tech kind of startup making space, hacker space there, and some things that, and I mean, I love your sort of, the way you're sort of making that in, identifying this space as in contrast or to something. And in India, what I have seen is this sort of, you know, gap of institutional kind of infrastructure that this culture is sort of filling, and I'm curious. So I'm just super curious with just thinking about the comparisons and I mean all this stuff about going physically to these markets and picking out the thing, you know. And I asked one time, you know, why don't you just, couldn't you just order these pieces online? Like surely, like no, I've got to talk to the guy, I've got to see the piece, I've got to see that, you know, and they're like little, you know, plastic knobs for the prototypes, and you know they want to pick them out anyway. So it resonates. There's a lot of similarities. But the regulatory contexts, right? Like that's what makes these, in India, you can develop a medical device and there's really no oversight, or I'm thinking of things with privacy or information, like, you know, how does that evolve in China? I mean, that's part of the source of innovation, or in India compared to the West, where, you know, or at least that's the story, where people here are straddled with regulatory kinds of issues. They have, they have to go through the FDA, they have to, et cetera. So I'm curious how that plays into the space, especially as they're thinking about commercialization.
Yeah, it's a kind of follow-up question, I guess. So, I mean, again, this sort of notion of, China being the wild, wild west is very often invoked actually now by venture capitalists, right? Who say, yes, the regulatory system is much more loose there, you can experiment in ways that are impossible elsewhere. And Shanghai is in many ways also celebrated as that, which I find very counterproductive, and it's similar to Jugaad, perhaps in India, where sort of these forms of the informal economy are celebrated as sort of the authentic Indian or Chinese innovation, that again renders it in line of catching up with the West, right? It's sort of like, oh, but as soon as you've adopted all of your regulation standards, intellectual property rights, then you will also become that truly modern, contemporary global innovation power, right? And so very often stories of Shenzhen and also Jugaad, I think, are being put in that sort of linear modernization narrative. And I see that, again, it's happening a lot, both from, people who are investing in China, but also from within China. So a lot of the politicians are also portraying, sort of informal economy systems like that, sort of like we need to upgrade that. So I think there are a lot of these similarities. I think was your question, there was something else in your question that I didn't fully capture, I feel like.
I was just curious about whether, like, even in a particular, like, medical kinds of advice, like, how would that work in China compared to, other places like this sort of regulation? Are people taking advantage of certain context or looseness in that way?
Yes, and I'm not an expert on this and I haven't been researching this, but there's examples of it, yeah, for sure. With experimentation in drug development, it can be really harmful, actually. So I'm trying to think if I can think of a name to give you. I'll look up something later if you wanted to look at some of the writings on the topic. Yeah, so there's an interesting company, not exactly the medical context, but genomics. It's called the Beijing Genomics Institute, and it actually moved its offices 10 years ago to Shenzhen, so it's now headquartered in Shenzhen. And that company actually, was leading in the sort of first human genome sequencing effort. And the United States really freaked out when that happened. And it was sort of a fairly sort of small-scale effort in the beginning, started by people who had, received training in the United States, came back to China and started this company. And then didn't receive much government support, but as soon as that news hit the ground, sort of hit media outlets and whatnot, then they received a lot of government support. But the company is really interesting when it comes to sort of its sort of relationships to regulatory systems. The company has an ethos of open source. I've been visiting the company several times and did some interviews there because I find it so interesting. So the average age of the workforce is 28. The current CTO, I think, is like 29. He's a college dropout, and they believe the sort of like genome sequencing as sort of the next, sort of step in sort of like technological advancement. And in part, the company's been so successful because they, again, it's a kind of manufacturing business that they develop these machines of, the genome sequencing machines that made it really affordable to do that. And that's why the company has been so successful. And again, for that project, they've adopted a kind of open source approach within the organizational culture itself, but also for the production. And they argue, this needs to be open source because this is a problem we as humanity share. And so again, it's like, it doesn't exactly sort of go into this question of the medical, but it's a company again that promotes this alternative ethos very much so in line with sort of like the quantified self movement and sort of more globally. And so it's a really interesting space. I've been doing some research with people who have type 1 diabetes and who started hacking their own Dexcom devices and built their own artificial pancreas. So I'm happy to talk more about this also later.
They're here.
Yeah. In Boston.
They're all over.
Oh, no, well, Dana Lewis.
Dana Lewis, yeah.
Is here in
Yeah,
Seattle.
yeah.
Yeah. And Wan Jian, from BGI.
Yes.
Isn't he a UW grad? Do you know that? BGI CEO? I think he has a connection to the university.
I don't know about that.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy. But
Yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah.
So.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for these questions. This was super helpful. And I'm going to do this for